When you look at what Mark Carney is bringing in, what do you think that will mean for the future of oil and gas?
Well, it will mean disaster.
This week, the Frontier Centre for Public Policy issued a press release highlighting 12 policy proposals to ensure that Canadians finally enjoy the prosperity that we work so hard for. The centerpiece of these policies is Canada's approach to the oil and gas sector, which has been demonized over the last 10 years. Here to talk to us about this and an incredible achievement they are announcing is the President of the Frontier Centre for Public Policy, David Leese, and Vice President of Research, Marco Navarro-Gini.
Let's take a look. David and Marco, welcome to Northern Perspective. It's great to have you here.
Great to be here.
Thank you.
So, David, we spoke a little bit about this a couple of days ago, and this is something that I know everybody at the Frontier Centre for Public Policy is very excited about and very passionate about. Why don't you run us through the press release and the announcement that you made?
Well, essentially, this press release distills down really what we think are 12 dynamite ideas to move and strengthen Canada. Policy matters. They're choices that impact the quality of our lives, the prosperity that we have as a nation. So these ideas, I think, are really important guides. We hope that they're helpful to citizens as they vote on Monday. Now, at the same time, part of the key issue that we're also announcing is the real-time counter that estimates the amount of money that we are losing as a nation because we don't get world market prices for our oil and gas. It's actually quite, frankly, an outrageous story where because of deliberate policy choices not to build those pipelines to get their energy to world markets where countries like the UK, Greece, Japan, all kinds of them are asking for Canadian oil and gas. We're saying no, there's no quote business case. So we can rectify that. So this counter shows in real time the amount of money that we're not getting. In terms of estimates, it's about almost $30 billion. That's a lot of money that we could be using to use for hospitals, roads, highways, all kinds of things. And so our Vice President of Research, Dr. Marco Navarro-Gini here, and the team have done an outstanding job to create that kind of calculator using a lot of work to be able to estimate the money that Canadians are not receiving as a result of this bad policy.
So, Marco, this calculator sounds like it's not really going to be something that Donald Trump is a fan of because he keeps telling us that we are subsidizing or the U.S. is subsidizing Canada and that there's this massive trade deficit and we should all, play some tiny violins for the United States. So what have you found in developing this calculator?
Yeah, thank you. Trump is right about some things and very wrong about a lot of stuff. And he's certainly very wrong about this idea that the United States is subsidizing the Canadian economy for some strange reason. The reality is, as David pointed out, there is a gap, or what the experts call the price differential, that energy producers in Canada, not just in Alberta, in Saskatchewan, in BC with the gas, they have to basically drop the prices by quite a bit in order to entice middlemen in companies or business people in the United States to make room in their pipelines for our gas and our oil. Because as we have heard many times before, these resources are kind of trapped in a sense for lack of infrastructure capability. And so that includes about 2 million barrels of oil from Alberta and upwards of 12 million gigajoules of natural gas from British Columbia and from Alberta. the oil is discounted at nearly $20 per barrel. That's what we lose on a daily basis, and about $2 per gigajoule. So it adds up rather quickly. By our calculations, and we've made some rigorous efforts to look at all the data, aggregate it, and make sure that we're calculating this properly, is roughly about $70 million per day, including both gas and oil. So you can imagine what that kind of money could buy. What is most interesting and perhaps egregious is that this money is not only not coming into Canada, but is essentially lining the pockets of these middlemen in America, because what they do with the resource is they pipe it all the way down to the coast in the Gulf of Mexico, and then export it from there at full market prices. And so that's money essentially that we could be getting as Canadians to build this country, to make this country the richest country in the world, as it has sometimes been observed. But instead, we are enriching middlemen in the United States.
So, and do you think this has come about, this forced discount, if you will, as a result of us not really having any means whatsoever to have any other customers? Because if I'm the United States and I'm looking at Canada, I'm saying, okay, so we need gas and we need oil. Canada doesn't have the infrastructure to offer it to anybody else. So why am I going to pay full price for it? If I want to be able to, get a great deal on this, and I know that they don't have anyone to sell this to because they can't sell it to anybody. Why am I not going to, demand a massive discount? Is that basically how we ended up here?
Yes, it sounds sometimes more nefarious than it is. But the reality is we have all these resources here that are kind of trapped. And so in order to convince people to buy it and to make the space to move it through that infrastructure that already exists, but it's limited, we have to give incentives to the people who are taking the product to make money at the other end. And so it's not that they're putting a gun to our heads necessarily, but it's a way in which, even at a loss, Alberta and Canada makes a little bit of money. The question is, we could be making so much more to pay for all the things that we're often strapped for. Right?
So one way to look at this is that we, in Canada, because we're in a weak market position by design, because we haven't built this energy infrastructure, namely pipelines, to get those other customers, we become, by default, a price taker, not a price maker. So if you compare a country called Mexico, they sell a very similar crude out of the Mayan area of Mexico, and they're right on the coastline. So they get full market price. So that's part of what guides the differential and proves that Canada is not getting world prices because we haven't done our work as a nation to build those pipelines to Tidewater and to make those extra customers.
And we know that the extra pipelines do work. Sorry, Ryan. Because recently, for example, the Northern Gateway pipeline was expanded. We are able now from Alberta to nearly triple the number of barrels of oil per day that we used to export through the pipeline before the upgrade, and that has already reduced somewhat the price differential. A few years ago, we were giving up almost nearly $25 a barrel, and now I think the last time I checked was a couple of days ago. It's now at $18 that differential. So that essentially makes the point that expanding the ability of these infrastructure projects allows us to sell these products at a better price.
And so Trans Mountain has made a difference. But what's interesting is that, again,
That's what I meant. Trans Mountain.
there's many different policies at the federal level that continue to undermine the flourishing of this industry, really for the benefit of all Canadians. So I'll just give you one example. So in Trans Mountain, all that oil ultimately moves to the Burnaby terminal and goes on ships to the markets. But the federal government has a ban, like a limit to the amount of tankers that can go along the West Coast. I mean, this is absurd. When every other country is encouraging this traffic, we're undermining it. So that's the dynamic here. We are shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to prosperity for every Canadian. And why is that? Because ultimately, every developed nation, their ACE card is reliable, dependable, affordable energy. And we have that in spades in this country. And that's foundational not only to, well, oil and gas, it's foundational to agriculture, manufacturing, mining, forestry, everything. So it's like a domino right through the entire economy. And we are not doing the fundamentals well on this at all. We're actually doing the opposite. We're undermining the entire economy.
And for Canadians watching, when you hear Pierre Poilievre talk about in his speeches, he talks about the tanker ban. That is what he is referring to specifically.
Correct. That's it.
We are essentially tying both hands behind our backs for, exporting oil away from the U.S. at full market price, and it just completely prohibits us from reaching that full potential.
So
That's right.
Why
and
is this happening? I know you said that it's happening from policy, but what's driving these policies? Why is this happening in Canada?
Well, part of it is it's gone through evolutions. Initially, it was because we had to, we initially were slow at getting these pipelines done, and that was arguably because of incompetence and regulatory red tape and all the rest. But the last 10 years, it hasn't been by incompetence, I would argue. It's been by design. It's been intentionally a war on Canadian oil and gas. And this is what is really, in many respects, the policy choice that really, I would suggest, faced Canadians. Are we going to continue with that war on oil and gas and hence the entire economy or not?
Yeah, a few years ago, while he was campaigning, the former Prime Minister came into town, into Calgary, and essentially said that oil and gas, hydrocarbon energy was going to be phased out. That the wealth, if you will, that is sitting on the ground in the oil sands in Alberta and in Saskatchewan would be phased out. In other words, we don't need it anymore. There is a very strong cohort of people who made it into the Prime Minister's office in the last 10 years. They're former activists of all sorts of different radical environmentalist movements, like the Sierra Club and the World Wild Fund and things like that, whose philosophy is to keep these resources in the ground because they are under this sort of quasi-religious belief that if we continue to use hydrocarbons, we will accelerate some sort of planetary doom. Now,
when you see what Mark Carney is bringing to the table and Mark Carney's ideology, he's written all... It's amazing he tries to even deny some of this because he wrote it all down in a book. And Canadians should really look at reading that. But when you look at what Mark Carney is bringing in, what do you think that will mean for the future of oil and gas?
Well, it will mean disaster. It's all a continuation of the war on Canadian oil and gas, and I would argue the economy. If you continue with net zero, if you continue with Bill C-69, a forever against pipelines bill, if you continue with a policy about tanker bans, if you continue with the, quote, greenwashing bills, which prevents, under law, the industry itself from explaining its environmental record. I mean, it goes on and on. I mean, it's incredible the amount of legislation that is in place to stop this industry. And there's no mystery as to why our economy is floundering. It's stagnated. If we look at our average income compared to the United States, it's almost a 35-40% differential now with the state of Arkansas. There's no mystery as to why Canadians feel like they're going nowhere fast.
And I just want to make sure I reiterate this for everybody watching. The Frontier Center for Public Policy is not a conservative-leaning think tank. It is a nonpartisan organization. They take everything at face value and strip it down to its bare nuts, and whatever is the truth ends up being put out there. So I want to make sure everybody understands that this, David, your organization is not putting out these reports for partisan reasons. They're not, developing this research to support any ideology, one or the other. This is just for the good of Canada, correct?
Correct. We have a passionate belief in the power of markets, private enterprise, community in this country to better serve Canadians. So regardless of what party, we are really promoting better public policy that serves Canadians. And if you look at the facts are in. Report after report shows this. Even the most recent report that came out of a kind of a unique policy shop within the own federal government looks at scenarios of 2040, and it's pretty dystopian, where people can't afford to buy a home. They don't have upward mobility. They don't have a future in terms of the next generation, and people are even caught with the need to do what? Like even go hunting to be able to make ends meet. And I would argue that future isn't 2040. That future is now. I mean, all you have to do is, again, like in this, emotional time where Canadians are saying elbows up. No, maybe we need to put our heads up and look at those issues and facts and then make wise choices that will serve all Canadians, not just simply special interest groups. So that's the kind of philosophy that Frontier looks at these things. It's a principled approach that looks at facts and evidence and says what is best going to serve Canadians.
On the nonpartisan question, I guess we could say that if the federal government, for example, tomorrow decided that Quebec's aluminum industry was an extreme polluter and that was accelerating the death of the planet, or fishing lobster out of the East Coast was going to be stopped, or we can go on and on, we would be on the exact same side, promoting sound public policy for freer markets and for the acceleration, the augmentation of the country's prosperity.
Well, and I guess it all comes back down to this narrative that is out there in the media, and they're pushing on social media, that the Conservatives do not have a climate plan. They do not, they're climate deniers, which at this point is ridiculous. I think everybody understands that climate is changing. And I think it's also ridiculous for people to suggest that nobody cares about the environment that is also in business. I think we've seen in Canada, and the oil sands is a great example of this, where you can see organizations that are wanting to A, make money, B, develop Canada, C, provide jobs for Canadians, but while also respecting the environment. And that when you compare oil and gas to the coal sector, which we all know that's what's driving China right now, when you compare those, the environmentally friendly option is oil and gas. So what we've been ascribing our thoughts to, and it sounds like this is echoed in public policy proposals as well as even what the Conservative plan is let's use our oil and gas to get high polluting nations off of coal, not look at Canada as a fishbowl microcosm and that's the be all end all, and then we can use our oil and gas to lower global emissions, from these other countries, bankrupt the dictating nations like Russia, and we can do well for the environment while bringing money into Canada. It's a win-win-win-win all at the same time. The problem is we need these pipelines built, which you outline in your policy proposal. But the problem is pipelines take 8 to 10 years, sometimes 15 years to build, and lots of people don't have the patience for that. But if we never get started, then we'll never finish.
Right on.
Yes, one of the things that is kind of puzzling, and you're right to point it out, is the global perspective. We keep saying that this has to include the global perspective, and Canada, by most calculations, produces just over 2% of global emissions. We learn. But if Canada was able, for example, to export enough natural gas to supply a place like India, and India would then generate about half its electricity from natural gas coming from Canada, or just about anywhere, really, but we're making the case for Canada. The amount of emissions that India would reduce equals about 3, nearly 4 times the emissions of the entire country of Canada. So
Right.
if we were really, really preoccupied by the global perspective, we should be more than gung-ho in selling Canadian natural gas. And the other issue is, as I pointed out earlier, I live in Alberta. I have been to Fort McMurray. I have seen the oil sands. And yes, part of it, while the mines are being operated, it looks kind of ugly. But, so does most industry around the place where the industry takes place. But the reality is the restoration of the lands once the resources have been extracted is phenomenal. And you wouldn't even notice it looking at it. The industry employs more biologists and ecologists in this province than all the universities and colleges combined. Right? That's the kind of commitment and the kind of effort to restore the places that have been mined to sometimes better than the original state in which they were found.
So the world needs more Canadian oil and gas. There is every evidence and fact-based analysis that shows that no one extracts oil and gas better in the world than Canada. This is an incredible strength of that industry. And so when we look at this, there are solutions, and that one of them is that we've promoted for years are utility corridors. The whole idea is to run a corridor several kilometers wide that would include everything from west to east to Tidewater, probably to Hudson's Bay, like Port Nelson, and to be able to not only ship energy, but electricity one way or the other, grain, uranium, everything. Canada has everything to offer the world. And so our biggest enemy has been ourselves and our government ham-fisted policy that's prevented us from being a trading nation. I mean, the absurdity of this is that we even have a nation that does not have free trade within it. I mean, this is almost comical if it were not true. And this undermines our GDP. This affects every Canadian because it basically rips people off by several $1,000s per person in this country. And so this has to be changed. There are solutions, and that's why we outline these 12 policy ideas.
Well, and when we first built our national railroad, that was an incredible achievement. That is the scale that really connected Canada from the west coast to the east coast, and it allowed us to trade on a level that many countries were dreaming of. We were able to do that. So when you talk about these corridors, the first thing that jumps into my mind is, okay, so we have pipelines, we have potentially water, we have rail, and what type of rail? We're talking about industrial rail and freight, which is great, but next to that, why don't we have that same corridor designated for high-speed rail travel across the country as well? Because we have such vast distances, and if they really want to get rid of more carbon emissions via air travel instead of looking at changing out the fuel, why don't we invest in high-speed rail? And that will allow Canadians to get from one end of the country to the other extremely quickly, and you don't have to plan 3 days to actually do it. So there's so many opportunities that can dovetail off of these policy proposals if we ironically just start thinking with common sense. But when you look at that worldview and the fact that just a simple math equation as that, if we are able to displace half of India's energy production with oil and gas, and that takes care of our negative contribution 4 times over, is it willful ignorance, willful blindness, or is it an intentional obfuscation to even look at the world market when we're looking at our own carbon footprint within the Canadian policy of the last 10 years?
It's certainly intentional. And we use all kinds of different excuses, like social license, for example, right? What does that even mean? And we make these things up as we go. The virtue and the amazing positive contribution of having these corridors David is talking about is that all those blocking excuses would disappear. If somebody wants to put, for example, transmission lines of inexpensive Quebec energy going all the way across the country to the western provinces, we could do that. You wouldn't have to apply for 1,700 new permits and spend 10 years trying to figure this out. And so it would essentially speed up all sorts of processes. That doesn't mean, of course, that the environmental impact studies and all those things that need to be done would stop. On the contrary, they would be done sort of prior and ahead of time to get these mega projects built. And this is the promise of Canada, as you were pointing out earlier on. In the Charlottetown Conference in 1864, there were these essentially autonomous colonies that couldn't get goods across each other's borders. And the whole point of coming together in this new dominion in 1867, and the document proves it. I mean, the BNA Act talks about the free flow of goods across provincial borders. And that remains 150 and some years later, an unrealized promise in this country. I think, a century and a half later, it's time that we start making the right moves to fulfill that promise.
Right on. In many ways, Canada is unfulfilled. We've got to get our basic policy house in order so we can grow up as a nation. For too long, we've had governing elites that have basically ruled this country with ham-fisted policy that's not been serving Canadians. And this is why people are struggling. And now is the time for Canada to grow up.
So what does this all mean for Canadians with the election coming this Monday, April 28th?
Well, we encourage Canadians to look at all the parties' platforms, to look at them with a critical eye, to use their minds, to put their heads up, to be able to look at the current reality of our economy and say, why is this economy stagnated? What are the solutions? And we're offering the solutions. We think that better public policy should guide the choices that you make in this election, not as partisans, but because we care about not just our own interests, but the interests of the entire country. We have the opportunity to be the most free, open, most prosperous nation on the face of the earth. We have everything to offer the world and more. So we have a chance to move forward rather than backwards. And I think that if you look at those policy platforms, you can see the very different approaches, for example, on energy.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
One of the things that one of the ideas behind putting all these policy suggestions in place is to allow Canadians to have a look at it and maybe ask questions of their candidates when they come and knock on their doors and say, "Here's this idea. that is supposed to make us more prosperous. Where are you, and where is your party on this specific issue? So the purpose really is to sort of try to enrich, if you will, the conversation. Now, in all humility, we don't have all the answers. We're smart, but not that smart. We don't know everything. but one of the things that we do and we work very hard at is to try to find ideas that have been used and have been tried in other places. This is kind of what we do in this center. We scope out policy solutions that the Swedes or the Germans or the Japanese have, for example, embraced, and we have seen them work in other places. And we often think, and we're often right on this, that these ideas would work just as well and often better in a place like Canada. One of the significant ideas in this document, Canadians would be perhaps not very surprised to find, given that at Frontier we have pushed this idea for over a decade now, is the question of reforming the fiscal framework of this country. And one of the steps would be, for example, to provide greater incentives to the provinces to grow their economies. At present time, one of the greatest hurdles to this in some areas of the country is what we know as the equalization program, in which the federal government transfers monies, this is beside healthcare and other money transfers, for the purpose of equalizing services across the provinces. So the idea is that somebody in Nova Scotia or somebody in Alberta should have more or less equal access to a similar quality of services. And that's a noble pursuit, is something that Canadians pride themselves in doing. Except that the program at current, in its current iteration, almost discourages economic progress, because for provinces to receive money, they need to be, well, needy. And that means that they don't have tremendous incentives to grow their economies, because the more they grow their economy, the less money transfers they receive from equalization. And so we propose that the federal government simply downloads all its GST receipts onto the provinces. So if a province, instead of equalization, gets all the GST money, that means that they're no longer afraid to grow their economy. On the contrary, the more they grow their economy, the more the tax income increases. And that's a tremendous incentive, to continue the program and to continue this idea that, yes, Canadians deservedly should have a kind of equivalent quality of services, but at the same time provide incentives for their economies to grow instead of incentivizing people to sit on their hands and have their economies shrink or not grow.
So how might this proposal be different than a province like Ontario, for example, that has a harmonized sales tax?
It doesn't really change anything, because the harmonized sales tax is essentially a blend of the provincial tax and the federal tax. So from that harmonized tax, part of it is already generated in what is generated in Ontario, part of it stays in Ontario, and the other part, the GST part, goes to Ottawa. In this sense, all of that receipt would stay in Ontario. And in a province like Alberta, where there is no GST, then there's no PST. I meant to say there's no provincial tax. Then that simply remains the federal transfer of the sales tax does not happen. It remains in Alberta.
Well, and I think this just comes down to something that you mentioned earlier, which is we need to stop incentivizing the provinces. We need to stop incentivizing, Canadians to be victims in this country. We need to stop rewarding people for essentially not working and incentivizing and rewarding
Indeed.
for work again, because that's what we've seen, especially over the last 10 years. And we saw this during COVID. We'll give you a bunch of money. And everyone said, oh, well, you know what? I could stay at home and not work, or I could go to work and work. Which choice am I going to pick? So when you give anybody that choice, and I don't think it's unique to Canadians, I think this is a human nature thing. If you give the choice to people, you don't have to do anything, and I'm going to give you a bunch of money, well, that's what they're going to do. But if you tell people, if you want to get money, you have to work for it, that is going to foster innovation, because that's where that's where people realize, well, if I don't do this, then I'm going to be in a lot of trouble from a financial and economic perspective. So I better put on my work boots and get out there and start working. And now, we see a much more prosperous Canada across the board.
You're right.
The examples of this are numerous. Imagine, for example, if you are a provincial bureaucrat in Halifax, and you are tasked with growing the economy. In your task in receiving, or not growing the economy, growing the number of dollars that the province receives. You want to be able to multiply the resources that the government receives. You can do it through taxation, of course, and that's always problematic because most people don't like to be paying taxes through the nose. Or you can grow the economy, which is actually hard work. It's not easy to just grow an economy and get more revenue. But if you could spend a couple of weeks out of the year trying to twist the politicians in Ottawa to tweak the formula so that Nova Scotia gets a few more million that particular year, that's all you need to do. So rather than to have to work hard 12 months out of the year to make sure that the economy of Nova Scotia grows, you can spend a couple of weeks consorting with your fellow bureaucrats in Ottawa, maybe even wining and dining them to change the formula, and Bob's your uncle, right? So again, human nature. It's not because they're bad people. It's not because they're not necessarily industrious. On the contrary, but we know that incentives matter. Right?
So on that theme, the real question in this election is, what kind of Canada do we want to become? Is it one where we play endless political games of the government to grow the economy and grow the Canadian dream? Or is it by unleashing the entrepreneurial talents of its people to grow the economy and move forward its prosperity? And part of the story that you may not have heard is the last 10 years, we've seen well over $1 trillion of money leave this country. It's left the country. But it's not just the money, it's the entrepreneurial talent, the people, the talent that you need to grow the A-team in Canada. And why have we done that? Because it's a brain drain, and we've created those incentives for that to all happen. And that is the tragedy that we've seen in this country. And it's all by choice, either by ourselves as government policies, or whether it's by the choices that we make as citizens as to who we elect.
And just to bring it back for Canadians that are watching, so you understand how real this issue is, in the time that we've been talking, we have lost $1,458,000 of opportunity cost as it relates to the discounts that we are just giving away with our oil and gas. So this is real money that is being accounted now real time by this tracker that the Frontier Center for Public Policy has developed. So you can see, somewhat depressingly, but more so from an information perspective, it should give you a different view of what is going on and how bad policy is really hitting us as Canadians across the board.
That's right. Yeah, it's a real-time number that shows how foolish policy is running around like with a leaky bucket when all that opportunity is flowing right out of it, when in fact we should be able to retain that to build this country. And I don't know, to me, it's a very powerful illustration of how current policies are not working. And that's the point here, is that many policies in this country are not working. They're not serving Canadians. So one of them we talk about is healthcare. where we need to free up the opportunity to empower people as consumers to choose how they're going to get health care. And this is modeled on countries like Marco referenced, international examples. In Sweden, you have a choice where you are going to get your health care, and it works very well. I mean, that's why that nation is rated at the top when it comes to healthcare. Why would we be afraid to not look at those examples and duplicate them in our own country? I mean, this is where we have to ask ourselves hard question: who is serving whom here? Do we care enough as Canadians to say that the status quo is not acceptable, that we want to reach for a higher level of standard so that we can be a better nation? And that's the promise of Canada. That's the Canadian dream. So instead of having it dissolve before us, we should be pursuing it with every effort we can for the sake of not only ourselves, but for the next generation.
Well, I don't think I could end it any better than that, David. So thank you for your time. We have to get going, but thank you so much for yourself and Marco and all of the team at the Frontier Center for Public Policy who work tirelessly to ensure that Canadians are better informed and that you're not just commenting on the problems, you're offering solutions to the lawmakers in order to make Canada a more prosperous and safe country for us all. So thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having us. It's a pleasure.